Today's video is sponsored by the good people over at Ancient Treasures. This is an amazing site that offers an impressive collection of jewelry, accessories, clothing, paintings, you name it. If you're like me, you always want to have something that reminds you of just how awesome history is. Ancient Treasures can make that a reality. Their Viking collection alone is awesome. I mean, check out how intricate some of these necklaces and rings are. But granted, if you're not into that whole Odin, Thor, Loki thing, why not try Egyptian, or Roman, or Wiccan? They have a variety of cultures to choose from. You can even try my favorite, the Templars. I'm actually going to get this t-shirt. In hoc signo vinces indeed. Now keep in mind, these can be more than just for your own personal collection. They make the perfect gift, especially if you have a history buff in the family. If you head over to ancienttreasures.com and use the discount code Flashpoint15, you'll be saving 15% on your first order and will be helping out my show as well. So do yourself a favor, hit the link in the description below and get your history on today. Again, big thanks to Ancient Treasures for sponsoring this video. A cold wind blew across the field as the two armies stared down upon one another. Like so many times before in history, when one ruler died and their throne was contested, it would take bloodshed to determine who would come next to power. The War of Castilian Succession, as it would be known, was about to reach its climax. March 1st, 1476 was a miserable day, cold, overcast, and at times even foggy. The battlefield was destined to be located near the town of Toro in the fertile lands northwest of Madrid. On one side was the aging Afonso V, the King of Portugal, who had led his men in this invasion of Castile. He assumed the center position of his impressive army, numbering approximately 8,500 men. His 21-year-old son, John II, commanded his left flank, which was composed of his elite troops known as the Chevalier. Prince John also had under his command soldiers who possessed weapons that were opening a new and much more destructive chapter in the history of warfare. They possessed the arquebus. That is, they were using firearms en masse supported by cannon. Afonso V's right flank was composed of not just Portuguese soldiers, but many members of the Castilian nobility who had defected to his cause. These noblemen were championed by Alfonso Carrillo, the Archbishop of Toledo, who had gone renegade and had come to the side of the Portuguese king. Afonso V had come in force to support Joana la Beltraneja's claim to the throne. She was the daughter, albeit some called her the illegitimate daughter of Henry IV, the deceased King of Castile who had died only a year and a half prior. Opposing them on the other end of the battlefield was the army of Castile, which numbered 8,000. Its right flank was composed of light cavalry supported by infantry under Álvaro de Mendoza, a member of a powerful noble house of Castile. The left flank held knights in heavy armor under the Duke of Alba and Cardinal Mendoza. In the center, the Castilians had a very strong line composed of the Royal Guard. It was led by Ferdinand, the heir to the crown of Aragon. Ferdinand was no stranger to warfare, and he, too, had come in force. His loyalty was to his queen and to her claim to the Castilian throne. This fight was to ensure that his queen would be known to all as Queen Isabella of Castile. Her claim, however, was in serious jeopardy, and as the two armies began to move in for the attack, Ferdinand knew that everything rested in the outcome of this battle. But despite his devotion and the strength of arms under his command, The road that had led to this war and now to the Battle of Toro, as it would be known, was one of the most difficult and harrowing ordeals that Ferdinand and Isabella had ever faced. A year and a half prior, on December 11th, 1474, King Henry IV of Castile had died in Segovia. Isabella was near her older brother when he passed. His death caused her to have mixed emotions. Their relationship, after all, had transcended the spectrum from love to hate. In front of all to see, Isabella professed her sadness and donned mourning attire. But at the same time, it was clear that she had anticipated this moment for some time. She was ready to act and use the element of surprise for all it was worth. After all, not many outside of Segovia knew that the king had just died. The day after Henry passed, funeral services were held throughout Segovia. The bells of the church of San Miguel began ringing, and soon all the churches in the city chimed in. The very next day, December 13th, 1474, it was Isabella's turn to cross her own Rubicon. As they would say, la suerta está echada. She appeared before her people in a long procession throughout the city. Her clothes of mourning had been replaced by the most resplendent of attire, indicating high nobility. She wasn't just emphasizing her claim to the throne, she was establishing her image of a ruler with dignity and poise, ordained to lead by divinity. Now, the preparations for this day must have taken months. From the jewels that decorated her dress, to the influential members of the city that comprised her procession, to the sword that her official who led the line had raised straight up, a sign of formidable strength. All the details of this day had been planned with intensity. The procession slowly made its way to the Cathedral of Segovia. There she was crowned, and soon after emerged to her people as Queen Isabella. Make no mistake, this was a coup. She was usurping power, and it was a profound act. No woman had been sole ruler of Castile-Leon since the days of Queen Berenguela in 1217, over 250 years prior. But before anyone could protest, she spoke to her people with distinction, swearing to look out for the common good, to bring justice to the land, to protect the nobility, and above all else, to be a defender of the faith. She asked for their loyalty, and the request was received with passionate applause. Isabella then brought forth her 4-year-old daughter, Isabel, and raising her up, she declared her to be the next heiress to the throne. It was another profound act. Isabella had just declared that a female had the right to be the successor to the crown, not just with her ascension, but also in the future. This precedent that she had just established, by the way, would have lasting effects that would reverberate not just throughout Iberian history, but throughout world history. That night, many of the great royal houses arrived and announced their loyalty to the new queen. This included the Mendozas, a significantly powerful family of Castile. As an aside, Isabella had worked with Rodrigo Borgia, destined to be pope one day, to elevate one of the Mendoza to the status of cardinal. Their loyalty to her would be the price. Isabella made it a point to sleep in the royal palace of Segovia that evening, as the people of the city continued to enjoy the fanfare which went on well into the night. However, even though she had seized power and was considered the queen by some, not all would be happy with her actions. Ferdinand was in Zaragoza, the capital of Aragon, when he heard the news a week later. Those around him at the time attested that he became insanely enraged and traveled to Segovia to see what his wife had done. As he made the week-long journey, he had time to think about how he would play this out. Reason would win out to wrath. On January 2nd, 1475, he entered Segovia in style, dressed in his finest, his entourage flanking his grand entrance. Isabella had planned for his entrance to be a spectacle. She knew she had to win him over quickly. Kristen Downey in the book The Warrior Queen takes up the tale. Quote, Ferdinand traveled in procession to the Alcazar, where he found Isabella waiting for him inside the gates. Suddenly, their roles were reversed. She was in control. Now he would come to her, not she to him. She was proceeding according to legal precedents established by previous queens. However, Isabella's ascension had seemed something of a theoretical possibility. It was viewed as plausible that a woman would rule in her own right. But it was quite shocking in reality. Male dominance was so customary that even Isabella's supporters were perplexed and confused. What Isabella had done was not unprecedented, but it was highly irregular. End quote. Now, in front of everyone in the Alcazar, the two acted with distinction and reverence for one another. But as soon as they were alone, the mood changed dramatically. Ferdinand flew into a rage, demanding an explanation of how his wife could act so erratically, so foolishly. Why would she do this to undermine him? In the book, The Queen's Vow, the author C.W. Gortner, I feel, captures Isabella's response perfectly. Keep in mind this is written as historical fiction, but nonetheless, quote, You did not consult me, he interrupted. You did not even write to ask what I thought. You declared yourself queen and had the sword of justice carried before you. You made it seem as if there were no other monarchs here but you. I stared at him, outraged. After all these weeks of uncertainty, of working myself to exhaustion in meetings, seeking to shore up Castile while he was fighting in France, surely he did not expect my sympathy. But then I spied in his expression a fleeting vulnerability in his eyes. With a sinking of my heart, I recognized the emotion. Fear. Ferdinand was afraid. He thought I wanted to keep him from having as much power as me, and he would be left exposed to the derision of my court. The Aragonese, who bedded the queen but had no right in how she ruled. His pride of manhood was injured. Relief flooded me. This was something I could deal with. End quote. On one end, it would have seemed that the marriage of Castile and Aragon was in crisis. Ferdinand definitely saw himself one day as being the king. However, Isabella had no plans to give her husband control over lands. She had something else in mind. She convinced him that her power was essentially just in spirit, ephemeral, that he would not lose any of his potency as sovereign. Furthermore, Isabella emphasized that if he was to undermine her, he'd be putting their heir, a female, into question as to whether or not she could one day rule as well. Isabella then went on to find one means after another to soothe her husband. Eventually, a contract known as the Concordat of Segovia was created which outlined their roles. For example, both of their names would appear in all documents and coins, albeit his would go first. This gave the illusion that he was the one dictating the policy of the land. In fact, Ferdinand would often get the credit and the accolade for progressive changes that were truly the work and genius of his wife. This was another masterstroke on Isabella's part. The queen knew her husband. He was more a man of action and was not always keen on being bogged down by bureaucracy. Plus, Ferdinand was not really good at Latin, the language of legal code. Isabella, on the other hand, threw herself into an intense study of the language, so she would be just as proficient as any of her counselors. When it came to establishing legal codes or treaties or important documents, nothing was going to get past her. Indeed, she even made all of her children learn Latin so that they would also be in that commanding position. It was an interesting compromise. Ferdinand had maintained his dignity, but at the same time, Isabella held her ground. She would go on to govern Castile and create its laws essentially as a sole sovereign, but even after she alone established a new decree or code, she would say, Póngase rey y reina, that is, sign it king and queen. The two were able to somehow make it work. The delicate balance of Castile and Aragon would hold together. But even as Isabella and Ferdinand got accustomed to their new roles, they were now going to face an even greater challenge. In early 1475, they got word that Portugal had invaded with a strong army. The War of Castilian Succession had begun. The King of Portugal was a proud and ambitious man who had always wanted Castile. He at one point intended to marry Isabella and take his prize of the Castilian throne, but the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella had destroyed that possibility. So what he could not take with matrimony, he decided to take with war. When King Henry IV of Castile died, his daughter and heir, Joana la Beltraneja, was brought to Portugal. Castile was then divided into those that supported Isabella and those that supported Joana as the next ruler. Afonso V, the 50-year-old King of Portugal, jumped at this opportunity. He married the young Joana la Beltraneja, aged 13, and also his niece, and then rallied the nobles of Castile that opposed Isabella to join his side. Finally, with his army amassed, he invaded Castile in May of 1475. He claimed he was there to put Joana, the rightful heir, back on the throne. The Portuguese king had over 10,000 men supported by cavalry and artillery. As he made his way, he spent vast sums of money to bribe the Castilian aristocracy. Even Alfonso Carrillo, the Archbishop of Toledo, decided to join the Portuguese camp. The Archbishop, by the way, who at one point had been a very strong supporter of Isabella, had now become unhappy. He had been overlooked. If you recall, a member of the Mendoza family was chosen to become cardinal instead of him. Isabella did not take this invasion of her land lightly. Ferdinand took direct control of the troops while she handled logistics. She then traveled all across the kingdom, raising funds and rallying her people. She demanded that they should, quote, make war by fire and by blood against the King of Portugal. For most of 1475, the two forces would meet only in skirmishes. The Portuguese, however, were able to make gains and captured several cities and castles along the lower Douro Valley. This included the important castle of Toro, which would serve as a forward base. To make matters worse, Afonso V had made an alliance with the French, who he expected would open up a second front, but they never did. That all said, one of the major advantages that Isabella and Ferdinand had was the fact that the longer the war dragged out, the less support Afonso V would have. His inability to deliver a crushing blow on Castile made him look weak. Afonso renewed his offensive in February of 1476. He was reinforced by his son, John II. The two laid siege to Zamora, where Ferdinand and his army had barricaded themselves in. The siege lasted for approximately 2 weeks, but the Portuguese army, exposed to the harsh winter, suffered tremendously, and so demoralized and exhausted on March 1st, they withdrew to the castle of Toro. Ferdinand, sensing an opportunity, launched his men in pursuit. About 3 miles from Toro, the two forces met. On this wet, dismal day, March 1st, 1476, near the banks of the Douro River, the two armies moved in for the kill. Prince John II of Portugal, with his elite troops, launched an all-out attack on the Castilian right flank. The fighting was intense. The prince showed his skill on the battlefield and kept his men organized in one cohesive fighting unit. This pulverized his opponent and drove it back. Screaming, "St. George! St. George!" the Portuguese demolished the Castilian right flank and the men in that line began to flee. However, Prince John was not able to exploit his early victory. Looking down the line, he saw that the rest of the Portuguese army was not doing very well at all. Masterfully, the prince decided to hold his men back and maintain his formation. He wanted to keep his men from getting isolated and disorganized. On the other end of the battlefield, Castile was winning. The Castilian elite troops under Cardinal Mendoza and the Duke of Alba had pushed the Portuguese decisively back, and in the center, Ferdinand's royal guard had inflicted major casualties. The fighting, especially around the Portuguese royal standard, had become extremely chaotic. In the middle of that intense fight, the standard bearer had had his hand sliced off, and so he moved the flag to his other hand. which was also promptly hacked off. And so, in order to keep the Portuguese flag upright, he used his teeth. That is, of course, until he bled to death. Now, seeing the royal standard fall, Afonso V lost his nerve. It was said that he threw himself into the fight to welcome death. However, at the very last second, he was held back by his men from becoming a bloody casualty. But as the Portuguese king was brought to the back of his formation, he watched as the Castilians crushed his center and flank. The Portuguese line then faltered and many broke and ran. Some of his men retreated only to drown in the Duero River that was behind them. The fighting across the entire battlefield at this point devolved into a massive brawl. Casualties mounted on both sides, and it was only the coming of night that brought an end to hostilities. From a military perspective, the Battle of Toro was inconclusive. The Castilians had lost on their right flank, but had won with their left. Prince John II of Portugal held the field after the fighting, but the Portuguese king had been withdrawn, albeit in good order. Both sides would go on to declare victory, but first-hand accounts of what actually happened during the fighting vary depending on which chronicler you read. However, one thing was certain: Isabella turned this into a political triumph. After all, it was clear that Afonso V and his Portuguese army were unable to deliver a quick victory, at least not on land. The Portuguese navy would triumph over the Castilian navy, winning Portugal major concessions later. Regardless, as long as Isabella and Ferdinand could resist, Joana la Beltraneja's claim to the Castilian throne seemed less legitimate. Many of the Castilian nobility that had followed Afonso now changed sides. Even the French refused to help the Portuguese king, at least not in force. In fact, Ferdinand, in an impressive move, even sent troops to occupy Navarre to prevent French aggression in that area. The Portuguese were not done. They would remain on Castilian soil for the next 3 years. Even up to February of 1479, the Portuguese would send in an army to take Mérida. But 1479 would prove to be a decisive year. In that year, the army that Portugal had sent in was defeated. What's more, the Pope annulled the dispensation that allowed Afonso V to initially marry Joana la Beltraneja. Again, she was his niece. With that one papal move, Afonso V had lost all legitimacy in this war, and for that matter, any chance of taking the Castilian throne. Peace between Portugal and Castile would finally come in September of 1479. Despite years of warfare, the terms were relatively lenient. Both sides would recognize each other's sovereignty. Afonso would give up his bid for Castile, and Joana la Beltraneja was allowed to enter into a convent and thus remove herself from the line of succession. Due to Portugal's naval victories, this treaty allowed Castile to keep the Canary Islands, but gave Portugal free rein to take anything south of those islands, meaning that they could take just about anything in Africa, and that area would now be off-limits to Castile. Remember this. This would be a very important point. This major concession would make Isabella and Ferdinand much more inclined to fund expeditions across the Atlantic to look for new lands to conquer. This is a point that we will definitely get back to later. For now, things were going very well for the royal couple. On February 20th, 1479, King John II of Aragon died. Ferdinand was now the recognized king of the crowns of Castile and Aragon, amongst many other territories. As his wife had done when she became queen, Ferdinand now also signed the paperwork to make her an equal co-ruler of all their combined lands. While Castile and Aragon would still have their own governing bodies, they were now essentially one massive, powerful state. Isabella now threw herself into the promises that she had made to her people when she became queen. The church and the aristocracy were both vigorously reformed. corruption in the government was addressed. The Queen replaced incompetent administrators with a meritocracy. A police force was created to bring criminals to justice under a new and much more rigorous legal code. Galicia, which was essentially ruled by thieves, was brought under control in 1481 in a prolonged campaign that crushed opposition. Isabella then shut down the practice of overproducing nearly worthless coins, replacing it with a currency that had merit. The economy as a result flourished. Money began to just flow in. The Catholic monarchs, as they'd be known, used this to start a vast building program. Ferdinand also set to work expanding and improving the army and navy, equipping it with the latest weapons. He established strong points and was able to secure the borders. Finally, the royal couple went to work creating a vast system of alliances through their children. Each one of their children, male or female, was brought up with an intense focus on education and was groomed to take a leading role wherever they went. Their eldest daughter, Isabel, was married to Prince Afonso of Portugal, not to be confused with Afonso V. This would cement an alliance with their Iberian neighbor. Their only son, John, and their second daughter, Joanna, were both married into the powerful Habsburg family, to Margaret of Austria and Philip the Handsome, respectively. Their third daughter, Maria, would also be married into the Portuguese royal house. And finally, the youngest daughter would be sent to England to secure an alliance. Her name, by the way, was Catherine. This princess would have books written about her. She would be known to history as Catherine of Aragon. Isabella and Ferdinand had accomplished so much. The economy, the government, the military were all restored. The Portuguese were no longer enemies, and a strong system of alliances with the major powers of Europe were underway. Despite all this, Isabella did not feel complete. She first and foremost saw herself as a defender of the faith, a new Joan of Arc. Isabella now felt compelled to start a new war, one that would allow her to accomplish what all the prior kings of Castile could not. To some, this new conflict would be regarded as the Queen's War. Its objective was crystal clear. Isabella was going to end the Reconquista and destroy the last kingdom of Islam.